The wind howled through the empty streets of Hollow Hill, carrying with it an unsettling chill that cut through the night like a blade. Oliver Fisher pulled his coat tighter as he approached the old Harrow house, its dark, looming silhouette seeming to swallow what little light the street lamps offered. He couldn't believe he'd let them talk him into this. Inside, Oliver's friends were already waiting, flashlights bouncing off peeling wallpaper and dusty, broken furniture. Sam, a lanky guy with a nervous smile, waved him over, his voice echoing in the cavernous hallway. "You made it, man," Sam grinned, but there was a tinge of unease in his eyes. "Bet you didn't think you'd actually come." "Didn't think any of us would," Oliver replied, feeling the eerie weight of the house pressing down on him. "But here we are." Beside Sam was Mia, her eyes scanning the darkness, every creak making her flinch. She was the bravest of their group on any given day, but tonight she seemed pale and tense. She gave Oliver a nod, her gaze locked on the hallway ahead. "You know why we're here, right? About this house?" "Just the basics," Oliver muttered, eyeing the cracked portraits on the walls, each face smudged by time. Harrow House had been abandoned for years. Rumors spread of the family that once lived here, tales of strange disappearances, twisted rituals, and sightings of something inhuman lurking inside. Kids at school swore the place was cursed, but no one had ever lasted long enough inside to see if it was true. "Legend has it the original owners were into dark things," Sam whispered. "They had a daughter who went missing. Some say she still roams these halls." "Come on, stop it," Mia snapped, her voice breaking the fragile silence. "Let's just look around, see if anything's out of place, and get out of here." The group ventured deeper into the house. Shadows danced in every corner, and the smell of mildew and rot hung heavy in the air. Each step seemed to echo as though something or someone were listening. They found themselves in a dusty parlor, and Mia's flashlight caught something strange on the wall. An old portrait. A young girl with hollow eyes and a ghostly expression stared back at them, her mouth set in a slight, unsettling smile. "That's her," Sam whispered. "The daughter." Mia shuddered and moved the beam of her flashlight away, catching sight of a staircase to their right. "We should check upstairs, just to be sure." Oliver's pulse quickened as he nodded, following Mia up the stairs. Each step groaned, and the old wood felt like it could crumble at any second. Sam hesitated, glancing back at the door, as if reconsidering this whole thing, but soon joined them. The upper floor was dark, colder, and filled with an ominous silence. A long hallway stretched out before them, lined with doors that seemed to whisper secrets. Mia tried the first door, and it creaked open to reveal a child's bedroom, untouched by time. The air was thick, stagnant, and the dollhouse on the floor had a layer of dust that almost looked like a shroud. Dolls sat in a crooked row on a shelf, their eyes seeming to follow as the group moved. "It's so cold in here," Sam muttered, rubbing his arms as he took a step back. Then they heard it, a soft, barely perceptible whisper. "Help me." Oliver's blood ran cold. He scanned the room, but there was no one there, only that strange, sickly sweet whisper, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Did you hear that?" Mia's voice was barely a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the doll on the shelf slowly turned its head, its eyes fixing on them. They all froze, watching in horror as its mouth began to move, forming words without sound. Then they heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and coming closer. They ran, stumbling into the hallway, but the footsteps seemed to follow, getting louder, heavier. Panic clawed at Oliver's chest, and they barely made it down the staircase, tripping, scrambling in a desperate attempt to get to the front door. But when they reached the entryway, it was gone. The door was no longer there. In its place was a wall, as though the house itself were trapping them inside. "This can't be happening," Sam whispered, his face pale, eyes wide. "Stay calm," Mia said, though her voice wavered. "We'll find another way out." A deep, guttural laugh echoed from behind them. They turned, their flashlights shaking as they saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It was the girl from the portrait, her eyes dark and empty, her face pale as moonlight. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice hollow, broken. Mia took a shaky step forward. We're just leaving." The girl tilted her head, her empty gaze piercing. "No one leaves." The lights flickered and the girl disappeared. In her place was the sound of something scuttling through the walls, like claws scraping wood, coming closer with each heartbeat. Shadows twisted along the walls, forming faces that snarled, eyes that blinked in the darkness. "What's happening?" Sam cried. clutching Mia's arm, his voice strangled with fear. "We need to hide," Oliver said, grabbing them both, dragging them back down the hallway. "In here." They dove into a side room, slamming the door shut. But the scraping grew louder, more frantic. The walls seemed to pulse, and they realized with horror that the shadows weren't just shadows. They were hands, reaching out, fingers stretching, clawing toward them. Mia whispered, "It wants us." Then the door slowly creaked open, and the girl stood there, her face shifting, melting into something monstrous, her eyes like dark pits of nothingness. She opened her mouth, and from her throat came a chorus of voices, screams, cries, whispers, all twisted together. "Join us," she said, her voice barely human. Sam bolted for the window, throwing it open, only to be met with solid stone instead of glass. Desperation painted his face as he pounded on it, sobbing, while Oliver and Mia backed against the wall, the shadow hands now inches away. The girl drifted closer, her mouth twisting into that same eerie smile. "You came to see me," she said, reaching out a pale, clawed hand. "Stay with me. Forever." The lights flickered one last time, and the room plunged into darkness. Their screams echoed through the house, swallowed by the walls, until there was silence once more. In the morning, Hollow Hill was as quiet as it had always been. The old Harrow house loomed dark and still, keeping its secrets. Only the faintest whisper of laughter could be heard, carried by the wind, as three new faces joined the smudged, faded portraits in the parlor, forever watching, forever waiting. The old summer cabin had been part of Alyssa's family for generations. Nestled deep within the dense, silent woods of Black River, it was a place they'd gone to every year, until Alyssa's grandparents vanished there one summer night. Years later, Alyssa's family finally gathered the courage to return. The cabin, worn by years of abandonment, seemed to exhale in eerie silence, as though it had been waiting. But Alyssa was determined. She wanted answers, some kind of closure for the mystery that haunted her family. She brought along her brother Jake, his friend Mason, and her cousin Erica, all of them eager to help her confront the unknown. The air was unnaturally cold that night, even for late October. The forest around them seemed to watch, shadows stretching like skeletal fingers. Inside, the cabin looked exactly as Alyssa remembered. Dusty, dark, and oddly preserved, as if time had simply paused. In the main room, her grandfather's old armchair still faced the fireplace, its cushions sagging, and on the wall hung a yellowed map of the property, marked with symbols no one had ever been able to decipher. "Why did they come back here?" Jake muttered, brushing dust off a picture frame that held a photo of their grandparents, smiling but somehow solemn, as if they knew a secret. "Maybe they heard something in these woods," Alyssa replied. "Maybe something called them." It was then that they heard the sound, a soft, dragging noise from upstairs like fabric rustling across the floor. They all froze, exchanging glances before Mason whispered, "What was that?" "Probably raccoons," Erica said, trying to sound confident, though her voice quivered. But there was something about the noise that felt intelligent, intentional. They crept up the narrow staircase, its wooden boards groaning underfoot, and pushed open the door to the attic. The air was colder, thicker, as if soaked in memories. The smell of mildew was mixed with something metallic, a scent they couldn't quite place. And then they saw it. A circle of broken mirrors scattered across the floor, reflecting only darkness. In the center of the circle was an old, crumpled photograph of their grandparents, faces scratched out, eyes hollowed into dark voids. "What is this?" Erica whispered, voice barely audible. Before anyone could answer, a sound like distant laughter echoed through the attic. But it wasn't cheerful. It was jagged, hollow, as though it had been choked out by something with no lungs, no throat. They shined their flashlights across the attic, catching glimpses of strange symbols scratched into the walls, the ceiling, even the floorboards. Alyssa's heart pounded, her every instinct screaming to run, but something kept her rooted to the spot. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow in the far corner, just beyond the reach of their lights, something human-shaped but wrong. Its arms were too long, its fingers twisted and reaching toward them. "Alyssa," Jake's voice was trembling as he took a step back, clutching his flashlight like a weapon. The shadow figure began to move, slithering toward them without making a sound, its body contorting in unnatural ways, joints bending backward. It stopped, and in a voice that sounded broken and far away, it whispered, "Stay. Stay with me." It was her grandmother's voice. Alyssa's blood ran cold, her legs refusing to move. She'd heard her grandmother speak 1,000 times, but never like this, so empty, so desperate. Please, the voice whimpered as the shadow drew closer. Don't leave, we're so alone. As it spoke, the air grew heavier, as though every ounce of grief and fear her grandparents had ever felt was pressing down on her, pulling her toward that dark figure. No! Mason grabbed Alyssa's arm, snapping her back to reality. Run! They tore down the stairs, practically falling over one another as they reached the main floor. But when they looked back at the staircase, they saw the shadow, no longer just one figure, but two. One was small, twisted, whispering. The other was tall, looming, its arms stretched wide as if to catch them. They bolted for the door, but as they reached it, it slammed shut on its own, the lock clicking into place. We need to go now, Erica shrieked, her hands clawing at the door. This isn't real. This can't be real. Alyssa felt a hand brush against her shoulder, icy and skeletal, and she screamed, spinning around. The shadows had crept closer, whispering in soft, lilting voices, words she couldn't understand but felt in her bones. It was her grandparents' voices, overlaid with something darker, something ancient. Stay with us, they whispered, stretching thin, clawed hands toward her. We're so cold here. Desperate, Alyssa remembered the map on the wall, the symbols her grandfather had marked in red. Maybe they meant something. She ran to it, ripping it from the wall, and immediately her hands were covered in black smudges, like soot. Her fingers traced one of the symbols, an intricate spiral, hoping, praying it would mean something. And then from behind her she heard a guttural hiss. What are you doing? The shadow lunged, its fingers barely missing her arm. Mason grabbed the fireplace poker, swinging it wildly, and managed to buy them a few seconds. Alyssa held the map out, shouting the only thing that came to mind. Leave us. The house shuddered, the walls seeming to groan with pain, and the shadows shrieked, writhing as though in agony. One by one, they slithered back into the darkness, retreating from the light from the symbols on the map. When the silence finally returned, the four of them stood in stunned disbelief, hearts racing, faces pale. Alyssa dropped the map, her fingers numb, and they bolted out of the cabin into the cold dawn light, leaving behind only the whispers that lingered on the air. As they stumbled through the trees, Alyssa looked back one last time. In the attic window, she saw two faint shapes, her grandparents, standing close together, watching. Their faces were no longer twisted or empty, but solemn, grateful. And then, as quickly as they'd appeared, they faded, lost in the shadows of the cabin. For years after, Alyssa would wonder if they'd truly freed their grandparents' spirits or merely unleashed something darker into the world. There was an unspoken rule in Willows Creek: never wander into Briarwood Forest after sunset. As kids, Lily and her friends had grown up hearing tales of the woods from their grandparents. Stories of people who wandered in and never returned, whispers of strange sounds and sightings of figures lurking among the trees. Now in their 20s, Lily, Evan, and Nora had long outgrown those tales, or so they thought. It was Halloween night, and Lily, feeling bold and curious, suggested they spend the evening in Briarwood Forest. They laughed, brushed off the old stories, and set out with flashlights, snacks, and a flask to celebrate the creepy tradition, as Evan put it. They reached the edge of the woods just as the last light faded from the sky, the tall trees casting eerie shadows over the narrow path. Everything seemed darker and quieter than they remembered. This place gives me the creeps, Nora whispered, hugging herself as the chill settled in. Don't tell me you're scared of a few trees, Evan teased, though his voice was unsteady. Lily rolled her eyes, but deep down she felt a strange tension in the air, as if the forest were holding its breath. Come on, let's go deeper. There's supposed to be an old well somewhere in the center. Bet no one's seen it in years. They moved through the dense underbrush, their flashlights barely penetrating the thick darkness. Shadows flitted at the edges of their vision, and every snapped twig seemed to echo for miles. Soon they stumbled upon a clearing with an old stone well at its center, just as Lily had heard. The well was weathered and cracked, with tangled vines crawling over its edges. As they approached, a strange metallic scent hung in the air, mixing with the earthy smell of decaying leaves. Smells like iron? Nora said, wrinkling her nose. But Lily knew it was something else. Something coppery. Evan leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight down. It's too deep to see the bottom, he said, his voice dropping. I wonder how far it goes. Lily stepped closer, peering down into the dark, gaping mouth. Suddenly, she felt a chill wash over her, like icy fingers pressing into her skin. She jerked back, her heart pounding. "Did you feel that?" she whispered. "Feel what?" Evan asked, his flashlight wavering as he looked at her. But before Lily could answer, a soft voice echoed from within the well, faint and distorted. "Help me, please." They all froze, staring at each other in horrified disbelief. It sounded like a child, desperate and afraid. "Did you hear that?" Nora's face went pale, her eyes wide with terror. Evan swallowed hard, his voice shaking. "It's probably just an echo or something. Maybe there's an animal down there." But then the voice came again, louder this time, and unmistakably human. "Please, don't leave me down here." Lily felt the hair on the back of her neck rise. Against every instinct, she leaned over the edge once more, her flashlight pointing downward. She could almost make out a shape, something small and pale, far below, shifting slightly. Nora grabbed Lily's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "This isn't right. We should go." But Lily felt compelled, as though something were calling her, pulling her toward the well. She took a shaky breath, her voice wavering as she called down, Are you all right? Do you need help?" The figure below shifted again, and the voice, now raspy and unsettlingly close, responded. "Come down, please." A sharp, metallic clang sounded from the well, like chains rattling against stone. Lily took a step back, her mind racing. No child could survive down there alone, not for long. Evan looked between the well and the dense trees surrounding them. "We need to get out of here." But as they turned to leave, the woods suddenly seemed darker, the trees closing in around them. The path they'd taken was gone, swallowed by a thick wall of trees that hadn't been there moments ago. The forest was eerily silent, not a single rustle or chirp breaking the stillness. And then they heard it, a low, guttural laugh echoing from deep within the well. "Leaving? So soon?" The voice taunted, but it was no longer that of a child. It was twisted, dark, dripping with malice. Lily's chest tightened and she stumbled back. The figure at the bottom of the well was climbing, its pale hands clawing at the stone walls as it rose slowly, deliberately, toward them. The flashlight caught its face for a split second, a stretched, hollow smile, skin tight over a skull-like head, and eyes that glowed faintly, filled with a hunger that was centuries old. Nora screamed, bolting into the trees. Evan and Lily ran after her, their breaths coming in panicked gasps as they stumbled through the thick brush, branches snagging at their clothes. But the forest twisted around them, each path leading them back to that terrible clearing, back to the well. As they reached it once more, they stopped, catching their breaths, fear overtaking every inch of reason. And then, in the silence, they heard footsteps behind them. Slow, deliberate footsteps, shuffling through the leaves. They turned to see a figure standing just beyond the edge of the clearing, partially hidden in the shadows. It wore old, tattered clothing that seemed to blend into the darkness, its face obscured beneath a wide-brimmed hat. But the eyes were visible, pale, milky, and dead. "You came here," it said, voice gravelly and low. "Now you stay." It pointed one bony finger toward the well, as if directing them, beckoning them closer. Evan stepped back, his voice barely a whisper. "Please, let us go." The figure's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "The forest doesn't let go. It's been waiting for you." Then, as if summoned, more figures began to emerge from the trees, their hollow eyes fixed on the group, faces twisted in expressions of pain and rage. Some wore tattered clothes from decades past, others little more than bones draped in rotting cloth. They moved in closer, forming a ring around the clearing. Lily clutched Evan and Nora, her voice shaking. "What do we do?" But before they could move, the ground beneath them began to shift. Roots twisted out of the soil, wrapping around their legs, pulling them down. They struggled, screamed, but the roots tightened them inch by inch toward the well. The last thing Lily saw before she was pulled under was the face of the figure at the well, its mouth stretched wide in a soundless scream, eyes endless pits of darkness. As the forest swallowed them, the clearing fell silent once more, leaving only the well, waiting patiently for the next to wander too close. And deep within the forest, on nights when the wind was just right, the townsfolk would swear they could still hear faint whispers echoing from Briarwood Forest, pleading for help, just like the ones who'd gone before. The town of Ash Hollow had its own haunted place. The derelict Holloway Sanitarium. Built on the edge of town over 100 years ago, the asylum had been shut down abruptly, leaving behind eerie tales of cruel treatments, mysterious disappearances, and endless suffering. Most people avoided the old stone building, but Tom, Sarah, and Lucas were not most people. Halloween was their favorite time of year, and when Lucas suggested they break into Holloway Sanitarium for a thrill, Tom and Sarah agreed, albeit reluctantly. The sky was dark as they approached the building, clouds smothering the moonlight, leaving only the silhouettes of twisted trees and the looming stone facade. "This is a terrible idea," Sarah muttered, hugging her arms as they walked up the cracked steps. "Come on, it's just an old building," Lucas said, though his voice didn't carry as much confidence as he'd hoped. "We'll go in, take some photos, and be legends." Tom pulled open the heavy door with a groan, the sound echoing through the abandoned halls like a death knell. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, shattered glass, and scattered, rusted wheelchairs left like forgotten corpses in the hall. As they wandered deeper, Sarah's unease grew. "I've read stories about this place," she whispered, her voice wavering. "They said the head doctor, Dr. Emery Holloway, experimented on the patients. They weren't treatments, they were tortures." Yeah, ghost stories," Lucas muttered, but his eyes darted down the hallway, unable to shake the feeling that they weren't alone. They reached the main hall, its walls lined with eerie portraits of past doctors and staff. The eyes of each figure seemed to follow them as they moved. In the center of the hall was an old examination chair, its metal strap still intact, stained dark with what looked suspiciously like rust, or something worse. Tom shivered, stepping back. "I don't know, guys. Maybe this wasn't such a great idea." But before anyone could respond, they heard it. The faint sound of footsteps coming from down the hall. It was slow, deliberate, echoing ominously through the silence. They exchanged terrified glances, unsure whether to hide or run. Lucas, ever the skeptic, rolled his eyes. "It's probably just an animal. Let's check it out." They reluctantly followed the sound, the footsteps seeming to retreat further into the darkened corridors. But the deeper they went, the stranger the surroundings became. The walls were marked with deep scratches, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Old restraints hung from the walls, some still with tattered, blood-stained fabric wrapped around them. Finally, they reached the end of the hall, where a door hung slightly ajar. Beyond it lay a room filled with metal cots and flickering lamps that cast long, twisted shadows. The smell of rot and something metallic filled the air, so strong it made Sarah gag. In the center of the room was an old journal, dusty and water-damaged. Lucas picked it up, brushing off the dust to reveal a name written in bold, jagged letters. "Dr. Emery Holloway." Lucas read aloud, his voice hollow. Sarah backed away, shaking her head. "We shouldn't touch that." But Lucas ignored her, flipping through the pages. The writing grew increasingly erratic, the entries descending into madness. There were diagrams of human bodies, bizarre anatomical sketches with notes that talked about unlocking the mind and isolating the spirit. Then, a final entry, scrawled in trembling handwriting, caught their attention. "The mind resists, but the soul can be broken. I will leave a part of myself in these walls. I cannot leave." A sudden, loud clang echoed from down the hall, the door they'd left open slamming shut with a force that sent chills through them. They sprinted to the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. "Guys, something's wrong," Tom stammered, frantically yanking at the handle. "This isn't right." Then, in the dim light, they noticed the shadows in the room shifting, like figures moving in the darkness. Shapes began to take form. A woman with hollow eyes, her hospital gown shredded, a man with his mouth stitched shut, a child with empty, staring sockets where his eyes should have been. Each one slowly turned to look at them, faces twisted in agony, mouths moving as though trying to scream. Lucas stumbled back, his voice a strangled whisper. "This can't be real. They're just shadows." But as he backed up, he bumped into something solid. Turning, he was met with the pale, grinning face of Dr. Emery Holloway himself. His eyes were lifeless, yet filled with a terrible knowledge, as if he could see straight into their souls. "Welcome," he said, his voice a cold rasp. "I've been waiting for someone. Fresh." The doctor reached out, one skeletal hand touching Lucas's arm. Lucas gasped, clutching his chest as though he were suddenly struggling to breathe. "Help me!" He croaked, but his friends couldn't move, paralyzed by horror. Dark shadows began crawling up Lucas's arms like tendrils sinking into his skin. His eyes went wide, his mouth open in a silent scream as he began to fade, his form becoming translucent, ghostly. Sarah and Tom finally broke free from their terror and bolted down the hall, but the corridor twisted and warped, leading them in circles. The walls pulsed as if alive, and they could hear Lucas's voice screaming somewhere in the distance, calling for them, getting weaker with each cry. They burst through a door, finding themselves back in the main hall. The examination chair now sat empty, its straps hanging loose, yet still somehow inviting. Behind them, Dr. Holloway's voice echoed through the hall, close but everywhere at once. "Come now. I only want to help. Don't you want to be free of all your earthly pains?" Tom looked at Sarah, terror etched across his face. "We have to get out, now!" They pushed open the main door and fled into the night, the cold air biting at their skin. As they reached the safety of the street, they stopped, panting, daring to look back. The sanitarium stood silent, looming against the dark sky. But just as they turned away, they heard it. A faint, chilling whisper. It was Lucas's voice. "Please, don't leave me here. Please, come back." They froze, tears streaming down Sarah's face as the voice grew fainter, more desperate, like an echo trapped within those cursed walls. They never saw Lucas again. But sometimes on silent nights, the townsfolk swore they could hear someone crying, whispering, pleading from within the ruins of Holloway Sanitarium. And no one who heard those whispers could shake the feeling that somewhere deep inside, Dr. Emery Holloway was still waiting, his asylum always hungry for more souls. The small coastal town of Bayhaven was known for its rocky shores and fog that rolled in thick from the ocean, blanketing everything in ghostly white. Locals claimed that on certain nights, if you wandered too close to the old lighthouse, you might catch a glimpse of the Watcher. No one knew where the legend began, but stories told of a figure who watched from the cliffs, waiting. For what? No one dared to guess. Olivia, Sam, and Matt had grown up hearing these tales, dismissing them as old town ghost stories. But on Halloween night, they decided to test the legend for themselves. They parked at the edge of the lighthouse trail just as the fog began to creep in, and armed with flashlights and some nervous laughs, they made their way up the narrow, rocky path toward the lighthouse. The lighthouse stood tall and silent, its light long extinguished, the keeper's cabin below it boarded up and crumbling. The air was thick with salt and the muffled sound of waves crashing against the rocks below. "This place is so creepy," Sam said, rubbing his arms against the chill. "How long's it been abandoned?" "About 50 years, I think," Olivia replied. "After the last keeper went missing, the one they say started all the stories." As they reached the lighthouse, they could barely see 10 feet in front of them, the fog swallowing everything. The place was unnaturally silent. They clicked on their flashlights, the beams cutting through the thick mist, illuminating bits of broken glass and pieces of wood scattered around. They wandered closer to the edge of the cliffs, but something in the air felt heavy, as if the fog itself were alive, pressing down on them. Matt, who had been quiet all evening, suddenly shushed them, his eyes wide as he pointed down the cliff. There, barely visible in the fog, was a figure standing at the edge of the rocks. It was cloaked in shadows, its outline tall and thin, facing away from them, looking out to sea. "Is that a person?" Olivia whispered, her heart hammering. "Probably just another thrill seeker," Sam said, though his voice wavered. "Or maybe someone messing with us." But as they watched, the figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, like a statue carved from shadow. Then, slowly, it began to turn. Its face was obscured by the fog, but they could make out its head tilting in their direction, as if it were watching them. A chill ran down Olivia's spine, her every instinct screaming at her to run. We should go," she stammered, gripping Sam's arm. But before they could move, the figure took a step forward, almost gliding over the rocks, moving toward them. Its face was still hidden in shadow, yet they could feel its gaze, cold, relentless, and filled with something ancient and hollow. Matt stumbled back, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "Did you see that? Did it move?" They didn't wait to answer. They turned and bolted back up the path, the fog seeming to grow thicker, wrapping around them like a web. The air grew colder, sharper, and the sound of the ocean faded, replaced by a strange whispering, like voices carried on the wind. As they ran, Olivia glanced over her shoulder and her heart sank. The figure was following them, its movements slow but unyielding, always just out of sight yet always closing in. They reached the lighthouse's door, panting, and pushed it open, slamming it shut behind them. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust, the faint smell of salt and mildew filling their noses. "Did we lose it?" Sam asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. But before anyone could answer, they heard it, a soft, dragging sound, like feet scraping over stone. It was coming from the stairwell leading to the top of the lighthouse. "What is that?" Matt whispered, pressing himself against the wall. Olivia took a shaky breath, looking up the staircase. Maybe it's just the wind. But deep down, they knew better. The sound was getting louder, closer, the slow scrape of something moving down the stairs, inch by inch. And then they saw it. A pale hand, thin and skeletal, appearing from the darkness above. It gripped the stair railing, its bony fingers curling around the wood, and a shadowy figure emerged from the stairwell. It was the same figure from the cliffs, but up close, its form seemed even more twisted, like it was made of fog and shadow, its face a hollow void. "Why, did you come here?" A voice echoed, hollow and cold, filling the room. The words seemed to sink into their bones, each syllable laden with an otherworldly weight. They tried to move, to speak, but the fear was paralyzing. The figure stepped closer, each movement jerky, unnatural, as if it were struggling to stay tethered to the physical world. "I watch, I wait, for those who wander too close," it whispered, its voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "For those who disturb the silence." Sam backed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. We didn't mean to. Lies." The voice grew sharper, echoing through the empty lighthouse. "You all seek, you all disturb, none of you listen." The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows, swirling as if alive. Olivia felt a creeping cold seeping into her skin, and when she looked down, she saw the mist slipping under the door, snaking around her ankles. It felt like icy fingers wrapping around her, holding her in place. The figure moved closer, its hollow face tilting as it examined each of them. "You will join those before you, the ones who called, the ones who wandered too close." Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, reality bending and stretching as their surroundings grew hazy. They could see other shapes now, shadowy figures standing in the fog, watching them with empty eyes. Dozens of them, all trapped in an endless silence, their faces twisted in eternal despair. "Help! Us!" one of the shapes whispered, its voice weak and broken. "No!" Matt shouted, pushing against the door, but it wouldn't budge, as though it had been sealed by the weight of the fog itself. The figure reached out, its hand brushing against Sam's shoulder, and he gasped, his face contorting in pain. His eyes glazed over, and he fell to his knees, his voice fading as he whispered, "I can't breathe." The shadowy figures in the fog moved closer, their hands reaching out, their faces blank yet filled with a longing that sent chills through Olivia's soul. They wanted her, wanted all of them to stay, to become part of the Watcher's endless vigil. With a desperate surge of strength, Olivia grabbed Matt and yanked him toward the back door. They burst outside, stumbling down the path as the fog closed in around them, the faint whispers growing fainter and fainter. When they reached the bottom of the hill, they stopped to catch their breaths. Turning back, they saw the lighthouse looming above. Silent once more, the fog settled like a shroud. The Watcher was gone, but the shadows at the windows were still there, faint outlines of those who hadn't escaped, their empty eyes watching. They never spoke of that night again, but from then on, they could feel it, an unshakable sense that they were never alone. And on quiet nights when the fog rolled in from the sea, they would hear it, the faint, ghostly whispers of those trapped at Bay Haven's edge, watching and waiting for the next souls to wander too close.